Oh my God.
Jeremy, and I am the New York City coordinator for Platypus. Briefly, I guess I can do the little, we don't seem to have dry erase markers. I'll put the website on the board for New York Platypus. We're an organization that exists to have conversations, critical conversations about the meaning of the left yesterday, today, and in the future, seeing ourselves as a moment for fundamental rethinking in a crisis time for left-wing politics. We have events, regular events in New York. There's a flyer back there with some of them. We have regular coffee breaks at the New School and at NYU. We have reading groups, both kind of about, more generally about the organization and also about the history of Marxism. And we also have events like today, as well as public interviews, teach-ins, and other things. So if you're interested in what we do, please... There are many of us here after the event. To some extent, the event is what we do. And also, please feel free to come and discuss afterwards.
There's also a sign-up sheet.
And there's also a sign-up sheet for the list host for New York City and our event announcements. And there will be another Communist Manifesto or Meaning of Marxism teach-in by Jamie Kiesling over here at the New School in 2 weeks and a day from today, October the 6th. So the information, we still are kind of finalizing on a room, but the information is there, and please keep abreast. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to give a presentation, should take about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a general discussion. The presentation sort of general theme is a kind of reading of the Communist Manifesto with the general overarching question about the relevance of Marxism today. Is Marxism meaningful at all? Any practical questions on that front? And then we'll have a general kind of freewheeling discussion thereafter. Cool? Okay. A caterpillar who has been slowly undergoing the maturation process, but finds himself stricken with the parasite Ophriocistis electrocera, OE, will indeed transform physically into a butterfly. But he cannot eclose. He cannot leave the chrysalis. The pupa that was once absolutely vital for his metamorphosis now becomes pathological. It is a brake on his development. He cannot fly. The Communist Manifesto addressed itself to a humanity whose development, like that of this potential butterfly, had stalled. But is there? Sorry.
There's a weird audio.
There's someone has something on, maybe?
I think that's me.
Apologies.
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry. So the Communist Manifesto addressed itself to a humanity whose development, like that of this potential butterfly, had stalled. But the manifesto is, after all, now itself an old, dead thing, 163 years behind us, passed over by the relentless flow of history. It's not even a specter. Is it at all relevant for us today? One response, yes, obviously. Capitalism is in the midst of a crisis of worldwide proportions. Inequalities have deepened the world over. Productivity has risen dramatically over the last 40 years, but workers see few of the benefits of their toil. Wages stagnate. Unions are beaten back by a savage class assault. The state is ever more shaped and controlled by the moneyed. Foreign policy is rigged to support the global status quo. Capitalism remains rapacious, nasty, cancerous. Or perhaps the relevance of Marxism ought to be given a tepid maybe. Marx is a really good critic of capitalist society, but he was, as we know, overly totalitarian, a class reductionist. He neglected the role of the middle class. He didn't understand the importance of the individual, etc. The Communist Manifesto, then, reveals some flaws in our contemporary society, of which we must take note, and we ought to use the machinery of the liberal state to alleviate the various sufferings. Or maybe the answer is just no. It's irrelevant. Socialism was tried, and it was a disaster. Capitalism has continued, despite Marx's diagnosis of its moribund character, to transform the world. Look at indicators like infant mortality, average age of death, etc. the world over. Capitalism is the tide that lifts all boats, if some more slowly than others. For these three views, Marxism is either a set of doctrines or a tool for social reportage, judging harshly the injustice of capitalist society and leaving us with the desire to make it more equal and morally just. I want to take a slightly different approach to the meaning of Marxism, adopting, for the moment, the spectacles the manifesto itself gives us. To answer the question of whether the Communist Manifesto is relevant today, I'll proceed by using its own method in order to illuminate it as an object. So what is the method of the Communist Manifesto? I offer two key characterizations. First, Marxism is a historical method. The assertion is simple. Nothing is eternal. Forms of life are characterized by birth and death. By viewing a given social fact with only the present in mind, we lose the fact that it actually doesn't exist now. This moment is the result of transformation, and this moment has indeed already been passed by, on its way to something else. The past and the future are then bound up with the present, so we will address the Communist Manifesto historically. Second, the manifesto is concerned with history insofar as human freedom is at stake in the story of humanity. Can we make the promise of self-determination on the banners of the French Revolution be the meaning of history? For Marx, it is truly up for grabs whether history will simply be one damn thing after another, or whether it will be the story of human development and liberation. Will history be the tale of chance and brutality, inhuman forces and dumb disaster? The future will retroactively decide on the character of the past. History and freedom may unite, or history may laugh quietly as it passes freedom by. As a way of combining this emphasis on history and freedom, I offer a motto from Friedrich Nietzsche, whose voice will be a sort of counterpoint to Marx's in my talk this evening. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, "Man is something that must be overcome." Man, historical humanity, persons as we have so far known them, is something that must be overcome in a new phase of self-creation and change. The Communist Manifesto, then, is a call to a concrete project of human freedom. I'll proceed through each of the four parts of the manifesto in turn to understand the scope of this project. Then, we'll highlight again the history and freedom as we return to whether it has any continuing relevance today. So part one of the manifesto is called Bourgeois and Proletarians. This part is obvious. We've all read the Cliff Notes version. Bourgeois equals bad, proletarian equals good. End, done, finished. But for a communist pamphlet, Marx spends an awful lot of time praising the bourgeoisie. Marx, the arch-revolutionary, says, quote, "The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part." A claim like this would seem to rankle everyone's feathers. The bourgeoisie, deathly afraid of Robespierre's shadow stalking every revolution. The socialist, lamenting the cruelty and horror of life in alienated bourgeois society. Leftists and right-wingers often converge in an anxiety over capitalism's shockingly destructive character. But not Marx. Bourgeois society's most important, and possibly most progressive characteristic for Marx, is its hitherto untold capacity for change. The history of the world may have been one damn class struggle after another, but there is something particularly important and new about the transformative character of capitalism. The dynamics of bourgeois society are restless, ceaselessly transforming whatever lies in their path. I give a long quote just because it's so good. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. This all certainly refers to the fact that the bourgeoisie itself rose to power by a revolutionary process, a fine rejoinder to any attempts to justify the present in some sort of sub specie aeternitatis way. But Marx is after much more than this relatively trivial point. He wants to analyze the peculiar dynamic of capitalism. Attempts to remain on firm ground are illusory and doomed to failure. No matter how much the bourgeoisie might even itself want to freeze things in place, to stabilize the ceaseless flux, certainly capitalists themselves are often not fans of the instability that comes with economic crises, technological advance, labor conflict, regime change, etc. Even the attempts to solidify the present push relentlessly towards something else. But what is that something else? What kind of transformations has bourgeois society wrought? Bourgeois society, for one, created a new internationalism. Capital proceeds fundamentally without borders. Technology flies across the world, prices are set internationally, limitations in domestic demand compel new markets to open, barriers between relatively self-sufficient economies are exploded. So too, barriers between human beings disintegrate. Aristotle presumed that slavery was necessary because there were two kinds of people, slaves and aristocrats, who had entirely different natures. In capitalism, everyone has to go to the market to survive. In this common activity, we come to understand in a practical way that all men are created equal. Our gender and sexual revolutions are yet another sign that what would have seemed entirely two different substances, man and woman for instance, are relentlessly equalized in capitalism. Bourgeois society also revolutionizes the labor process, creating untold riches with ever-dwindling labor inputs. I quote, "The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry and industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor?" End quote. Bourgeois society creates the potential to harness human forces in ways hitherto unimaginable in order to create massive material wealth and technological marvels. The liberal philosophical dream of thinkers like Immanuel Kant, Thomas Paine, and Adam Smith of a world of equal individuals interacting in a society that allows them their full development as human beings in peace and progress is rooted in something real. Bourgeois society is something unique and potentially progressive. Calling Marxism anti-capitalism is thus a simplification, even a mystification. To understand why Marx does not then hang up his hat and become Milton Friedman, we must understand how bourgeois society's restless change is also limited, how it frustrates its own progressive tendencies. Capitalism also has the peculiar dynamic wherein change is not linear, but also, as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more things stay the same. For instance, the kinds of crises capitalism produces. Marx's image ought to be familiar. Quote, "Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells." Marx got it from Goethe's poem, Der Zauberlehrling, or The Sorcerer's Apprentice, as did Walt Disney a bit later. The Sorcerer's Apprentice uses his magic to conjure assistants to accomplish his work, a living broom. As we know, though, he cannot control the broom. In this poem, the master steps in to take matters under his firm hand and control the chaos. For Marx, it is the sorcerer himself who has lost control, not the assistant. The mastery the bourgeoisie possesses is a sham. This is particularly clear in the crisis of overproduction. Here again must be emphasized capitalism's historical uniqueness. Most of human history has been characterized by the problem of scarcity. Crises come from bad crops, which mean insufficient food, which mean death. Nature presents profound limits to humanity. Instead, the modern world is characterized by crises of plenty. Labor is too efficient. A new machine or a new process triples efficiency, so the firm downsizes, thrusting the workers back into the vagaries of the labor market, rather than allowing them to sit back and sip pina coladas. Goods are overproduced and sit collecting dust in warehouses. Countries around the world are too good at specializing their food crops and producing in massive amounts, so when prices rise, their people cannot eat. Proliferating international media of communication only waste our time and make us stupid. When modern economics enshrines scarcity as the central principle of human life, it is, in a real sense, behind the times. It is not natural scarcity, but the organization of society that blocks the manifold potential for human self-realization capitalism itself creates. Class struggle in capitalism is both a new development in, and the revealed secret of, all class struggles past. Class struggle is not ultimately over the distribution of goods. It is a struggle over human destiny, over whether our social powers will benefit or destroy us, over how we are made and what we might become. The crisis of bourgeois society also has a political form, which already manifested itself even in the French Revolution. The Titanic of political change hits the iceberg of the economy, this independent realm with mysterious laws to which all must bow in obeisance. Capitalists have mammoth control over resources and thus make political equality a mere formality since the state is on their side. Well, the economy demands it. Slaves in Guadeloupe want to become free in the name of the French Revolution. The economy says no. The free individual worker is forced to hit the pavement for a job that stupefies and bores her. It's the economy, stupid. How can freedom and democracy survive in light of the limitations the mode of production poses to political will? The crisis of bourgeois society, its inability to meet the possibilities it had created and the promises it makes, has a subjective side too, the development of the proletariat. All too often, Marxism is consigned to social analysis of the objective world. We'll kind of get to maybe why that's especially now more the case. But Marx's whole point is that the peculiar possibility of capitalism lies in its human, all too human character. Marx's great hope, his wager as it were, was that the crisis of capitalism was also at the same time the slow coming to consciousness of a potential inheritor to the bourgeoisie in the realization of modern freedom. This again has its objective side. Workers are concentrated in cities and production sites like factories. Despite the wonders of the world being created every day, they are listless, frustrated, precarious, poor. The commodity, the essential form with which we interact and which shapes our lives, is sometimes a person that might try to change her social role. With this objective side, then, the subjective. Workers try to assert their rights. They try to develop within the bounds of bourgeois society, and they reach certain limits. They fail again and again, but may recognize something significant in that failure. They may transform that failure into the condition for a more radical success. They may realize new possibilities. They may remake themselves, and thus the whole social world which is produced by them. As Marx puts it later, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves. Man might self-overcome. We move to part 2, the Manifesto, Proletarians and Communists. So the proletariat, for Marx, represents the possibility of capitalism's most typical product, the commodity, and its most typical result, the crisis, of becoming self-conscious. But what do communists have to do with it? Marx puts it like this, quote, actually I'm going to skip that for a moment. In some sense, for Marx, what is not so important is the particular form that political struggles take at any given moment. Organizational form is, at least in part, determined by specific conditions. It might mean a party, it might mean something else. What does not change is that Marx saw communism as the attempt to reveal and make conscious the potential meaning of modern society. Proletarian struggle might reach beyond the struggle of oppressed versus oppressor that has thus far characterized human history. It might allow us to take a qualitative leap out of the miserable conditions that have thus far characterized social existence. This is a far cry from the eternal struggle of the downtrodden that characterizes both contemporary liberal and radical thought. Both assume that the fundamental coordinates of human history, the David and Goliath face-off, as it were, are here to stay. The radicals may see the problems as going much, much deeper. They may see themselves as more activist in their approach to fighting for David. But the idea that the struggle continues characterizes both. Capitalism, thinks Marx, might change the rules of the game themselves. Nietzsche again. Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. End quote. Communism would be the Pascalian wager for freedom rather than for God. Being a communist is to act as if freedom exists. So what do Marxist communists do? They, quote, point out and bring to the front the international and the historical character of the movement. And I quote, the communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. 1. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. in the various struggles of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, in the various stages of development, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. End quote. Marxist communists, then, are tasked with continually foregrounding for the proletariat the links between the past, the present, and a future of self-creation beyond the economy as we know it. They push forward the universal character of this change, its meaning for humanity as a whole. And as he goes on to do in the rest of the section, they remind the bourgeoisie and most importantly the workers that what they seek to do is realize the potentially liberating developments of the present. Real freedom, real individual development, real choice and consent in intimate relations like the family, real internationalism, real intellectual inventiveness. All these Marx shows to be the natural children of bourgeois society, as is the proletariat. This is especially important because confusion on this issue abounds. The proletariat is the center and essence of capitalism for Marx. Any expectation for change and progress, then, does not proceed from the margins inward, from some explosive outer force ripping apart a nasty, totalized whole. Instead, it corresponds to making that totalized whole a conscious, and therefore changeable, society. Marx critiques those whose only interest in the proletariat is its misery, as the greatest suffering class. It is precisely because the proletariat is capitalism's most typical product that the individuals in it might be able to finally end what he calls humanity's prehistory. Okay, this is part 3 of the manifesto, Socialist and Communist Literature. We arrive at, I think, the most underrated section of the manifesto. Here Marx lays out clearly the key method by which the communists will accomplish the tasks he has set out for them, to be conscious of and pushing for the full set of possibilities the present offers up. It is through critique of inadequate responses to the present that the future becomes clearer. Marx delineates several of the different currents running through the radical movements of his day. We don't need to let the specifics of these hold us up. There are some forms of consciousness he discusses that are relatively reminiscent of today. For instance, Marx critiques leftists who attempt to roll back the wheel of history. Under this category, all forms of nostalgic socialism based on the good old days of peasant production, or nobles who really care about their serfs, proper native hierarchies a la Avatar, like the good traditional hierarchies versus the bad corporations, etc. Then there are the kind-hearted, those who want all the good of capitalist society without the bad. As Marx put it, they desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. In the name of sympathy with the suffering of the oppressed, they try to manage the terrible problems of the modern world, thereby sidestepping the potentials these problems present. Again, I'm reminded here of Nietzsche's Last Man, who can no longer give birth to a star. Alas, the time of the most despicable man is coming, he that is no longer able to despise himself. We might add other categories on our present list of sort of the left that needs critique. The suffering worshippers who flit from struggle to give some meaning to their existence in an unfree world. The community fetishists who prefer a local to a distant tyrant, etc. We don't need to expand ad infinitum here. The important lesson is that the Communist Manifesto poses an essential critique of that moment's left and its inadequate responses to the possibilities created by the historical movement of capitalism and the proletariat. The proletariat might be the, quote, self-conscious independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, end quote. How might this self-consciousness be achieved? By a constant, ruthless critique of its own limits, with an eye toward how they might be transcended. This yoke is not easy, nor is this burthen light. Finally, part 4 of the manifesto, positions of communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Marx ends the manifesto with a reflection on his moment, which was a rising tide of Europe-wide liberal revolutions that would follow mere weeks after the publication of the manifesto. His view on the bourgeoisie's potential to complete its own revolutionary political process became much darker soon after the failure of these revolutions. The bourgeoisie was cravenly willing to sacrifice freedom to law and order. Ironically, that 1848 moment gets often compared to the Arab Spring, which is kind of, weird because it's usually as like a moment of excitement and triumph, but 1848 was this massive failure that required immense dramatic rethinking on the left. But the relation between the communists and these political movements is the same as the relation to the aforementioned socialist theorists and the relation to the proletariat itself. Marx again emphasizes the engagement of communism with the left of its day, that it might clarify and distill the left's, and so also capitalist society's, limits and potentials. Critical engagement, the tasks of the proletariat ahead, internationalism. The communists in the movement of the present also represent and take care of the future of the movement. The communists then seek to guarantee the upward learning curve in humanity's halting attempts to complete the promise of modern life. What was then the upward learning curve? They are a kind of caretaker, not of a holy book by Marx, but of certain historical possibilities that might change the character of human history thus far. Again, Zarathustra. I love him who justifies future and redeems past generations, for he wants to perish of the present. Now, to kind of bring it back to reflections on the present, Nietzsche said of bad conscience that it was a sickness, but a sickness rather like pregnancy. It is hard to see our sicknesses today, declining welfare states, shoddy resistant art practices, creationism, shallow erotic lives, gentrification, Walmart, as pregnancies. We are more than anything, perhaps rightly, tempted to see them as terrible, terrible dead ends. And we then, if we are on the left, impose an abstract, sentimentalized horror. The left becomes little more than a Sunday school preacher hectoring society for all its many sins. The Communist Manifesto asks us to take up the task of making the schoolmarm a midwife. It is about time that we were born. Rosa Luxemburg, the German communist, claimed that humanity faced a choice: socialism or barbarism. Marx discusses in the manifesto that instead of world historical progress, you might get the ruin of the contending classes as a result of the class struggle. Best of these kinds of quotes, for me, is Engels, who in his The Origin of Private Property, Family, and the State characterizes civilization like so. Quote, every advance is likewise a relative regression, in which the well-being and development of the one group are attained by the misery and repression of the other. Everything engendered by civilization is double-sided, double-tongued, self-contradictory, and antagonistic. The Communist Manifesto calls on us to redeem the barbarism that civilization has wrought, and to put it at the service of human self-transformation. It proceeds by focused attention on historical possibility, and a critique of the left for falling behind what might be in order to reconcile itself in one way or another to what is. But if Marx's moment was one in which the failure of liberalism was becoming apparent, surely ours is one in which the failure of the left in all its forms, especially Marxism, is the reality with which we are confronted. Anyone saying today, quote, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, would be dealing in absurdities. The Eurozone crisis is the only specter haunting Europe. The manifesto today can only ask us to risk the possibility of profound human emancipation while navigating past the shoddy compromises the present beckons us to take. Maybe a little something like Odysseus's, insanely long Odyssey, or maybe like Joyce's retake on that. The relationship between theory and practice is woefully abstract, as the last spark of that international labor movement Marx sought to transform threatens to disappear. So we compromise and lower our sights and look to anything and everything as the continuing signs of man's struggle for liberation. The specter of Marxism is a little like the black hole at the center of the Milky Way. It is the gravitational center, but it is invisible to the naked eye. Our protests and tics and frustrations and compromises and terrors might become, paradoxically, more productive when we recognize their ground, which itself might mean that we abandon many of them. Does bourgeois society still retain its world historical potential? What is the left, as it gives up the prospect of realizing these potentials, for the diminishing returns of the realistic win? The manifesto asks us to take a world historical view, to see the problem of freedom in its full international and historical depth. And it asks us to, as Nietzsche coquettishly puts it, to become what we are. Nietzsche, to become what one is, one must not have the faintest notion what one is. I'll let that sink for a second. Indeed, we do not know what we are or might be. We might, through political critique and action, be able to shape our collective destiny. But the missed opportunities add up. The failures are no longer lessons leading us to inexorable progress, but quicksand in which we are sure to sink. The tradition of all generations, all dead generations, weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Marxism might be the shovel we can use to start digging our way out from, to put it, bluntly, the shit, those dead generations, and to transform them into a horrifying but cathartic prelude to human freedom. And then the most difficult task might be posed, exercising Marxism itself. Again, man is something that must be overcome. So, thanks for listening. We should just open it in general to conversation about anything I said, about the left, about Marxism. I think the table is open. Or the chairs are open, because I'm not going to say anything else.
Jeremy, what was it that you read to us? Something you synopsized?
Yeah. Boy, history is that over, huh?
Does Marxism matter these days?
Okay, so yeah, specifically let's at least frame it in terms of Platypus then. Of course, given this talk in terms of introducing to the group, so perhaps you can at least give us something to grasp and move, and also talk about Platypus. What's it trying to do right now in relation to what you just read, your sort of presentation on the Communist Manifesto?
I mean, it seems to me that that what Platypus is trying to do is, a sort of difficult, contradictory, strange thing, which is trying to claim that on the one hand, one can take very seriously the claim that Marxism is basically totally irrelevant to the present, but also say that in a sense, that makes it the most relevant thing of all. That it's sort of like a present irrelevance. Again, that's why I use the black hole at the center of the Milky Way kind of metaphor. And what that means is that it's unclear that much of what left politics and left activity means today in the present is the frustrated attempt to work through what Marxism now could mean, but not as self-consciously as it could be. Often in a very sort of oblique way, similar to a psychoanalyst, right, notices that a neurotic patient through his sexual neuroses is repeating mistakes of childhood or problems of childhood, going back to problems of childhood, but has no clue that that's actually what's happening. Instead, that person kind of totally thinks that they are living in the present, doing their own life sort of thing. So I guess what I see Platypus as doing is attempting as much as possible to bring that kind of neurotic repetition into the light of day. It has been phrased as the attempt to psychoanalyze the left in the past. And the way it does that is largely through, attempting to create the best conversations on the meaning of the left that exist right now, which Marx, in his moment, was also trying to do, though he had a much more kind of forceful, clear vision of what the future of politics was, certainly, than I have, and probably that what most people in the room have, I would imagine. Maybe that's a start. I don't know if other people have things to add. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I love just the room, but I have a question. I don't know if it relates to this. I guess one of two things that kind of stuck out in your presentation, and I wonder how you might kind of articulate a reconciliation of these two concepts, is on the one hand, you talked about this kind of equalizing nature of capitalist society, of the individuals in capitalist society, right? So kind of a homogenization in a certain sense. The example of Aristotle thinking of slaves and aristocrats as two distinct types of people versus no distinct type of person under capitalism, versus the Engels you quoted, and this kind of double-sided nature of the organization of society under capital, and the fact that there's always, the kind of rise of one group with out of another group. So it's kind of like inherent inequality versus the kind of homogenous nature of capitalist society.
Or the like continuing production and reproduction of inequality. Yeah, I mean, you know, modern racism, maybe even racism writ large, is like a phenomenon of capitalist society. Like, and so one can, you know, I mean, it's complicated because, you know, Aristotle thought there were like barbarians and Greeks and, you know, never the twain shall meet. But like certainly the idea that like one's color means like a significant, you know, one's color and one's like intellectual capacity are related, that's a totally modern phenomenon. And so it's, I think the issue is that capitalism produces in some sense the ground for the discontent with this continuing form of regressive inequalities that it produces, right? So like no one in Aristotle's society, or it's almost inconceivable that someone would have said, well, no, Greeks and barbarians are really the same. Like they might have said things like, well, the difference between Greeks and barbarians is not that important, or it's better not to go to war with the barbarians, or whatever. But the idea that like it's an offense against human dignity to think of Greeks and barbarians as two fundamentally different sort of types, like that is only that would be such a totally foreign way of thinking to the ancient Greeks or to medievals or to whatever. So I think that I would say is the double-sided character, that at the same time that capitalism reproduces and produces all of its own pathological inequalities between people, the sort of grounds for attempting to transform them, the claim that like all human beings should be free and equal, that's in like whatever, the Declaration of Independence or what have you, like that's totally a modern capitalist bourgeois notion.
I think very much what you said, that practically speaking, the bourgeois world had created everyone equal in I suppose, the wage form of labor, which is sort of a natural thing, Marxist thing to say, but it never quite occurred to me like that.
Adam Smith says we're all merchants now. Like,
yeah. And so it occurs to me that I mean, Marxism is maybe more relevant than ever because people take for granted now that the economic conditions produce our consciousness, I think.
can you expand on that a little bit?
Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not in academia.
And by the way, sorry, one sec. I'm sitting up here, but like we should feel free to have a civil but open discussion if people want to respond to each other too. Go ahead, Chester.
Just that no self-respecting scholar these days would deny that kind of thing happens. For instance, that the wage form becomes dominant, and that changes the way people think about the world and their place in it. That everybody sort of takes that for granted to one degree or another. It seems to me. I don't know if that's really the case, but
yeah, maybe. I mean, certainly politically, I don't know how much that's the case. So, for instance, like recently, politically, right? Why is it important? Like, who cares that some new form of consciousness appeared somewhere in the like 16th, 17th century in Europe, right? Like, the reason I think this is politically important is because the claim that this is like it has a qualitatively new character and makes qualitatively new demands on like what politics should look like. But unfortunately, sort of that it seems to me often gets obscured. And so for instance, like it's easily sort of like peasant revolts in the 12th century or, women resisting like, Lysistrata or something is combined with contemporary, like the contemporary left, all in kind of one soup of like resisting the oppression of dominative forces. Rather than saying, well, look, these kinds of claims towards freedom and equality, these kinds of claims towards progress, which are distinctively modern, mean that like modern forms of politics just ought to take different forms. And attempts to assimilate modern forms of politics into older ways of thinking become just confusions about what we can be about, and they become ways of limiting ourselves and our potential.
I mean, you said in your presentation that calling something like Marxism anti-capitalist was obfuscatory, it was confusing, and I think that because what just comes to mind when you raise something like this is that the way in which the capitalist world is actually a new form of social freedom as much as it is a new form of social unfreedom. It's tricky though, right? Because the integration of something like slaves into the capitalist system doesn't necessarily mean that it creates a better world for the subject. And yet the very sort of structures that are opened up by capitalism create this kind of formal possibility that otherwise wouldn't be there, to present the possibility for something like free labor that would, if including these slaves, could transform their political agency in this world. But there is this contradiction at work, which I think does present a set of problems for historians and sociologists, etc. That taking a quick glance, even Adam Smith recognizes that slavery within the capitalist world is actually more exploitative than prior to. And so the question for us is, what do we mean by sort of opening up new spheres of emancipation? Because it's, I don't think, reducible, therefore, to sort of freedom for the particular individual, let's say, in this particular colony that is creating this product for a capitalist power in the world. But what does it mean? I mean, you use, I know that you're using Nietzsche to sort of really drive this point of becoming, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you mean by sort of emancipation, becoming. What is it that you're finding at the core of Marxist politics that isn't reducible to I am free from a system of domination?
Speaking of Nietzsche, there's a somewhat famous Nietzsche quote, stop telling me what you're free from, tell me what you're free for. I would say, one, on slavery, that's certainly right. Slavery of bourgeois, slavery didn't exist in Europe from the, basically from the fall of the Roman Empire till, the rise of, the colonies, so the beginnings of bourgeois society, right? So, slavery was gone, it was done. In Europe, at the very least. It was still going on in other places in the world, but nothing, And with bourgeois society came, a renewal of this form of barbarism that, had been gotten rid of for a very long time. So this is not to say, again, I think that's a right point, that slavery is bound up just as much in the creation of bourgeois society as any sort of freedom. I think the idea was that the idea in Marx's claim was that the bourgeois revolutions, or bourgeois politics, or liberal politics, or eventually what became left politics, was about sort of basically the contradictory nature of bourgeois society becoming sort of realizing its own contradiction, becoming frustrated with that contradiction, and overcoming it from within. And that the problem had been, you have basically every liberal worth his salt in the 18th century, Adam Smith, Condorcet, yada yada, was anti-slavery. They all recognized that slavery was at the deepest core opposed to the principles of liberal society. But that raises the question of, what are the principles of liberal society, and how could you have a society that created these principles, but also created the horrible, terrible means by which those principles were violated? The hope for the liberals was, if you had less warlike states, if you had free labor, if these various things were introduced, then you would get the end of this kind of self-contradictory dynamic, and you'd get kind of the pure realization of the ideals of our society, the ideals of humans being free to transform themselves and being subject being subject to one another and being subject to their own decisions, man as an autonomous agent, meaning man giving his own law to himself. That in Marx's moment, Marx is saying basically that hasn't become the case. It hasn't worked out that way. It was something else needs to happen. A new kind of wrinkle needs to be added to this kind of transformational process. Otherwise, we're going to be kind of stuck in the groove of the present. The freedom from and freedom for question is the hardest one, because I did kind of point out in the manifesto that primarily Marx issues critiques of inadequate ways of thinking about the present as sort of ways of thinking about the future. There's an Engels quote on this in The Origin of Private Property, Family, and the State, where Engels is talking about the future sex life of humanity, and he says basically that I hope that future generations won't give a shit about what we say about their sex life. I hope that they're going to have, the full opportunity to express and make meaningful life for themselves erotically. And, we should not try to limit what they are trying to do with themselves by sort of saying, no, this is what it will look like, sex. It will look like whatever, polygamy or polyamory or whatever. Engels, Engels was a kind of playboy kind of guy. So, so that kind of worry about imposing on the future its own direction makes me reticent to talk about free for. But certainly the free for idea at its fundament, I think, is the idea that the decisions we're making about ourselves, the way in which we're living life is creative and is a product of our own decision-making process, individually and socially. I don't know, maybe a decent analogy is, again, to psychoanalysis, where, the point of the doctor's relationship with the patient is not for the doctor to tell them, the kind of life they should be leading, but, in fact, to try to help them remove blockages for them making active decisions about the kinds of lives they want to be leading. I don't know how satisfying that is.
It's very abstract. I mean, what are
It's
the
really
blockages
abstract.
today? I mean, you keep going back to the bourgeois revolution.
Mm-hmm.
What do those blockages look like today? What would the communist movement today focus on as clearing the way towards these less abstract forms of thinking?
I mean, in some ways, this is where the Marxism's just as relevant as ever is true. Certainly, the crisis-ridden character of capitalism is only ever more clearly the case today. And in some ways, the present that we're living through, which is likely to see sort of, on my estimation, the decline of sort of the statist mid-century compromises in Europe, is in some ways the proof that you can't just sort of patch the corners of this society, that there's something really at its core of the relationship of human beings to each other, of the relations of humans to the economy, that needs to be transformed in a quite radical way. That's the sort of most clear economic sort of answer. But I think there are a lot of other ones. I mean, I mentioned some of our contemporary sicknesses, but I think Walmart is a great sign of both the necessity of and block of the realization of socialism, right? Walmart is this incredible concentration of human capacity to distribute goods in an efficient way, and this is why I can't stand the sort of leftist hatred of the standardization. Oh, it's all standardized and it's miserable, and it's these awful white trash people who go there and are degrading themselves, and if only I could have my own zine and my own kind of cool t-shirt, then I could be authentic. I think Walmart is a clear sign of human possibility, but also obviously a sign of degradation and misery, and both for the workers who work there, but also of standardization and conformity, etc. For Walmart to be a creative expression of man's capacities, again, this sounds somewhat abstract, that is what I think communism ought to stand for.
I think one of the other definitions that you gave of the significance of the manifesto today was how it existed as a critique of the limitations given upon the practices of the left at its moment, the conditions of possibility of a real radical movement, and that there was a critique of the limitations that these movements are facing. And, of course, we can do that today, and Platypus certainly we attempt to do it today. But there's the clear and present example of Occupy Wall Street. How is it that is right now the highest expression of radical politics in the United States? Perhaps people could argue whether or not that is, but sort of the most visible at the moment, right? Sort of what's in the news, potentially. And so what is that character to say, let's blame Wall Street, let's blame American finance, or let's blame the banks for the sort of the demise of the country? And sort of what kind of limitations does that politics really offer for potential radical left, or even just what is the role of Marxism in relation to that kind of politics?
The interesting thing about that and your presentation, but maybe I'm just really tired, but the entire time I was listening, I couldn't tell when you were naming off examples if they were contemporary or if they existed in the past. Because a lot of those forms have existed for hundreds of years, and something like Occupy Wall Street probably existed 100 years and it was done better. So,
I mean, it's, Constantine and I had a recent email conversation where, he had me read the sort of why statement of the Occupy Wall Street, since we're on that. And, what fundamentally it represented was like a moralistic critique of capitalism. It was like, we live in a commodified society. The logic of the capitalist economy is cancerous. It grows for its own sake. It cares nothing about human beings. And what we need is a cooperative, solution to this. If anything, if communists can do anything in the present, and again, I'm somewhat skeptical as to how much, because I do think without the context of the kind of rapidly politicizing society that Marx was looking at, it's very hard to imagine again, practical political goals. Certainly what I think communists can do is try to prevent exactly that kind of consciousness where politics becomes only about an abstract opposition to what is. What is sucks, and I believe that it's immoral, it's wrong, and I ought to oppose it because I'm a moral, good human being. Instead, what Marxism tries to do is still see, if Marxism is relevant, it's if it can still see the present as shot through with possibilities of the future. If that's impossible, maybe it is impossible, and then, then we're pretty much screwed. Then Marxism really isn't relevant, and then bourgeois society has basically closed a page, that we're kind of stuck with this status quo in more or less interesting forms for eternity, perhaps, or until the planet gets destroyed, which might come sooner, or we destroy ourselves or whatever. But if what the sort of, I guess, again, leap of faith, I use Pascal, that I think intellectually perhaps one has to take, and even politically one has to take, is the possibility of the still transformability of this society. And the problem is when one doesn't recognize how much of a leap that is in some sense, but also how important that leap is to making anything meaningful.
Right, I think what I've always liked about the idea behind this teaching is that it asks questions, does Marxism even matter? Is that question is answerable whether or not we want to make it matter. And that it is really a proposition about how we're going to treat the present and the future. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore, but it is possible, and maybe it's only up to us to make it matter. And that's what I like about the question, that it poses it in that way, because it sort of tasks us. It's not just sort of abstractly see the present as a moment of lost opportunity, but how is it that we can once again consider our present as a moment of opportunity? What will it take?
Are there other people who haven't spoken?
I was just going to say about your leap of faith. For me, it's not so much, I'm speaking very personally, it's not so much that I have to believe that society is transformable, but that we can actively take control of that transformation. For me, that's and I suspect that's what a lot of people, a lot of people who the left would want to win over. It seems to me that would be one sticking point. That a lot of people don't have that faith anymore. I don't know.
but you mean on a level of leadership, the level of leadership of society, or the level of what do you mean by?
Well, just the skepticism, I think, is that projects of trying to take control of the transformation of the world are doomed to go astray, go the way of Russian Revolution.
So the specter of Stalinism is haunting.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely real.
So So yes, we can't just, do little repairs. We can't just put band-aids around the corners. But on the other hand, where does one start in the total renovation? Can it be done? That's the sort of skepticism that I deal with.
I think a lot of my skepticism and Marxism in the past 80 years or so, skepticism is tied to the fact that in Marx's day, the Marxist present was shot through with possibility in the form of the proletariat, the grave diggers of capitalism that were created by capitalism. And of course, no one has been able to answer the failure of the immiseration thesis in the early 20th century. And with the entire disappearance, but gradual abatement of the creation of the proletariat, who do you turn to for that Lukács's universal subject-object of history? That might provide some concrete substance to grapple with this question.
I mean, I would say like two things about immiseration. Like one, if anything, actually, I think interestingly, we're probably moving much closer to immiseration in the present, and that the reason that is because it was in fact it was the product of Marxism itself that the immiseration thesis didn't come true, right? Like it was massive worker-organized social democratic parties across the world that, or at least across the Western world, that prevented the proletariat from being as nasty, is sort of immiserated paupers. Well, I don't think that's the case. But what I'm saying is it's exactly the sort of issue of like self-created problems, and certainly like the problem of sort of look at the monster we've created, which was like the welfare state, which was both like great and helped many human beings live much better lives. I want a 2-month summer vacation and not having to work in academia to get it. Like those are meaningful, real advances for many human beings. But on the other hand, they are very much like the kind of limitation on the scope of what was imaginable for humankind was also itself the product of those victories. I think Marxism at its best was the attempt to figure out how to critically push forward that dynamic, which became much harder to imagine when you had Stalinism in the Soviet Union that had basically kind of ridden onto that dynamic as well, which was basically like, look, you be slaves in the factory and we'll give you good apartments, like nice housing, no crime, like, nice living conditions. Like, and similar in the West in many ways, that became sort of the high point of what it meant to be a human being, was a huge problem that leftists, I don't know if they ever really figured out how to deal with. We're in a very different moment. Nobody believes in that anymore. So what that means for the future, I'm not sure.
The Lukács bit, I was just thinking about like this problem of like the proletariat, in a particular type of problem in the 19th century, but a more confusing one in the 21st century, certainly. But I think that what Jeremy's presentation at least was trying to grapple with was, is it the case really that Marx is looking to the proletariat as the revolutionary subject in a kind of like inherent way, sort of pointing to the fact that there's a presence of these particular subjects in society, and therefore capitalism will be overcome? Well, Lukács especially, right, which is he's not sort of pulling this out of nowhere, but I think that he's trying to redefine or recall like Marx's own definition of like the subjective dimension of capitalism, is that Marxism could mean a kind of recognition of a historical possibility. At least like this seems to be the argument here, that capitalism presents these historical possibilities otherwise unfathomable, otherwise unseen, and that in part it does this by creating such a force like the proletariat, but that the proletariat is key to the reconstitution of those same constraints, but it could potentially lead somewhere else. The question, I guess, in the present, and obviously the question also for like the new left, let's say, was that like in the aftermath of the failure of a proletariat revolution, what does one do? You know, like the New Left had some sort of notion, some New Leftists did, of like looking to other parts of the world or looking to other people that would take up this role of a revolutionary subject. But I think in light of the presentation, and if we're thinking about Marxism as a way of recognizing and making sense of historical possibilities, was that actually what the aftermath of the failures of the proletariat revolution really called for? To like find new subjects of revolution? Or did it really call for a kind of deep reinvestigation of historical possibilities? And, you know, as far as I'm concerned in the present, that's really what a responsible leftist could do, meaning investigating our time for thinking about the future in terms of like what is possible in the present, may actually be more true to that proletariat legacy than it is to say, well, who's the next sort of revolutionary subject?
I mean, I'll say something briefly, and did I see a hand over here? I thought I did. But, I mean, you know, one way of thinking about this is sort of like, and I was actually thinking of the New Left as well, you know, in retrospect, we can recognize that the 60s and the 70s were this massive moment for kind of like a change in the guard of sort of like world capitalism. Similarly, I think we are on the cusp. Either we're at the end of that moment, or we're on the kind of cusp of the other one, however you want to phrase it. But like we're in for kind of a profound political shift. Right now, I think the vast majority of what that has meant is generally like either moves to the right or very ineffective sort of splatters of resistance that have ended not very well. Organizations like the SDS, for instance, in the 60s tried to, you know, sort of saw this change coming, were themselves part of this change, and attempted to like make that politically meaningful as students, as in some sense like intellectuals, tried to make that like a meaningful change for society. They created a massive, you know, nationwide organization. Similarly, I think we are in many ways tasked with that issue, which is we are in a moment of transformation. We're in a moment of transformation that is not at all guaranteed to go left wing. In fact, probably won't. And so the question is, what are we as thinking people, as intellectuals, capable of doing to, in some sense, like make relevant a historical imagination again? Like the sort of the conceit of Platypus is organizing people to have sharp critical conversations about left-wing politics is a like first baby step in the direction of what that would mean, what it would mean to intervene in a present that's likely to get more confusing, and that in which we're seeing big shifts. I mean, even something like the Arab Spring, the more kind of like optimistic moment of the present situation, is a mixed thing, right? Because the Arab Spring also means the end of many of the like etatist regimes of the mid-century, similar to what's ending in Europe. So the end of this attempt to kind of control capitalism on a nation-state level, to provide kind of a bought-off working class with relative amounts of authoritarianism at the top, that stuff is ending in the Middle East, in Europe, everywhere. And so I think what that means for the present is going to be up to us. And I think we have a responsibility to make it meaningful in a way that if we don't, like, it will likely be, what are the, you know, mean, stupid, and short, whatever Hobbes for the war of all against all. Brutish. Yeah. Which is, I think, both a very pessimistic position and an optimistic position at the same time. Right? Like, very pessimistic insofar as, like, you know, if you read, like, leftist papers, wherever there's a protest, it's a sign of the oncoming revolution, right? And then, like, the protest is put down, it's the sign of the nasty bourgeois counter-reaction, but, like, the revolution is always kind of hidden away, ready to burst out at any moment. Like, that's not what I'm calling for, you know? That's not the kind of present shot through with potential that I'm calling for. What I do think, though, is that the irrationality of our society is in some sense more and more obvious, but also more and more difficult to politicize, to like make politically meaningful at all. And that's only going to be more the case as the various kinds of ways of integrating people into the status quo, or even like giving them decent lives, are going to disappear more and more, which I think is going to happen in the next 10 years. That's my like actual political prediction. There you go. You cornered me.
I guess I would quibble a little with the prognosis. I mean, it seems to me that, on one level, Marxism is clearly relevant because people are still all over the world talking about Marxism and communism and socialism, all of that. And it will be relevant as long as people are talking about it. And as long
people are still talking about Christianity. I'm not trying to make the argument that it is as relevant. Or maybe it is. Maybe it's more relevant.
It drives strife in politics around the world. So
that's right.
Yeah.
For better or for worse.
So I guess I would say, yeah, there's plenty of reason to be pessimistic, but wherever it goes, there's going to be a struggle because people like us everywhere are going to be resisting what we fear, resisting the veering off into the whatever version of right-wing tyranny or authoritarian.
Or we ourselves turn right-wing. That happens too at moments of crisis.
I can't see that happening to everybody.
I don't know, you read...
It seems to me that's part of the leap of faith, that there's something else pushing people along.
I think the question is, what would it take for the kind of, like... Yeah, so right, there's like pressure and change, and then there's in some sense like the, what is it, reflex that you go to the doctor, like, right, our knees are being hit with a hammer, and like, yes, there will be like a kick. The question is like, is that kick going to be what it is at the doctor, which is just like a sign of things being relatively normal, or could it be like a kick in the balls for emancipation? Like, I think like that, I don't know, that just came to me.
That's not the way.
Stop with your castration anxiety,
We're talking about Engels again?
Like, it seems to me that the resistance that to some extent, yes, inevitably comes with structural changes in capitalism will need to be much more meaningful. Otherwise, I mean, the last 40 years, sure, have seen a lot of resistance to like neoliberal global restructuring. But in terms of like actually transforming the general direction of human affairs, it's meant very little, sadly.
I think the difference is like how Marxism is relevant. And I think in the beginning of your presentation, as you pointed out, Marxism can be relevant because people talk about it, because it's a nice way to analyze a book of literature or critique a piece of art.
I think Terry Eagleton says that Marx in most academic departments is now just a really good reader of Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, and the point is it's not relevant for that and for something else.
Not that I'm knocking Wuthering Heights. But.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent to share this idea that, I mean, I know you're not saying this, but, there are people who do think, well, the worse the situation gets, the more kind of like radical resistance one can find. And it does really throw into question what the left is. Like, is it, some kind of like rebellious nature that's inherent in every human being? Or is the left about sort of consciously grappling with the possibilities of historical transformation? And those two actually are not like, like that, one is not reducible to the other, I think. I think that right now we can look at, like, the Euro crisis is, quote unquote, opening up these, like, spaces for discontent. But that political discontent is being expressed in, I would argue, somewhat, like, conservative forms. I mean, meaning, like, I don't know, people are going to say that conservative, but, like the Pirate Party winning 9% of the vote in Germany, like, obviously, like, it's a clear sign that people are like upset with the social order of things, that they would like say, okay, here's this sort of like younger generation that is providing some form of political leadership. The status quo isn't really serving me. We think the world is shit. So maybe there, right? Like maybe there lies some kind of possibility for transformation. But like one has to raise the question, like really, is it, like is that like, Is that the kind of like opening? Like, is that really? Maybe we can talk about the Euro crisis as a kind of missed opportunity. I think certainly one can characterize the revolts in North Africa as a missed opportunity. And what's happening in Greece as a missed opportunity. Meaning, like, these are all sort of like moments in which a leftist politics, if it were to be organized, ready, and sort of like present in the world, could actually like educate people on the kind of historical possibilities of the moment. But there isn't really a left that is doing that, and so what do these moments mean? Maybe they mean like a reaction from the right. Maybe they mean like further confusion on the left as to what the left stands for. I'm not sure if I share the sense of sort of optimism about the situation.
Right. The question would be not the question, but I think that summing some of this up, it's historical consciousness of the present. That the opportunity provided to us now is to recognize that the present is not a moment of opportunity for the left, and that might be a little bit too pessimistic, but I do think that might be the sort of most honest and response what's going on in the present. And that actually that raises a lot more questions of what needs to be done.
I wouldn't say that it's a complete lack of opportunity. I think it's like the ability to be clear about defeats and victories, and not to paint when you failed as a victory, not to celebrate the fact that you sat in Wall Street for a while and then you got arrested. It's not a great thing.
I mean, I think it would be, it's sort of like, I don't know. I mean, I think, again, we're at a moment when, things are dying, when, old species are becoming extinct, old species of thought, of political organization, of state order. And so then the question is, I do have some, I do think that it might possibly, those are when creative things, if there's ever a time for creative things to happen, those are when creative things happen, at moments when sort of you see, the decline of old forms. But for this to be a kind of creative, inventive moment for humanity, it would take quite a lot. And certainly, today, sitting here, we as humanity are not ready for that. All we're ready for is the meteor to come crashing down and us dinosaurs to all end. Which is likely what will happen to Marxism as well. Make no mistake, we are the only chance Marxism has, basically, of surviving more than 20 years from now, because most of the organizations, the last recrudescence of Marxism, the 60s and the 70s, those organizations are going to last much longer. Their founding members are now getting old. They're going to decline. They're going to die. So for Marxism and the kind of imagination it represented to maintain itself, it requires us to take a new, meaningful, responsible approach to the present and the future, because it won't happen automatically, I don't think. Should we end there?
Did you mention the reading group? Your reading group?
Yeah, briefly.
Okay. Maybe I'll make a pitch for it now that we're closing. One of the general main activities that we try to do on campuses is host what we call a Marxist reading group, and we've both investigate. Currently, there's a syllabus online. In New York, there's 2 reading groups. But in NYU, we do have one on Sundays, 1 to 4, at the Puck Building. The details are on the website. But take a look at the syllabus. We will be reading a lot more of Marx, and we're going to be eventually in the spring dealing particularly with this early 20th century moment of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, and sort of what it was the moment of 1917 and its aftermath all about. And so there's a real sort of attempt now in the syllabus for the fall to discuss the sort of history of Marxism. And so perhaps it is definitely a place to continue this conversation.
And if you're just sort of interested in what we do, there are 2 reading groups that happen in NYU. One of them is more introduction sort of to Platypus, we do a lot of events like panels, and we have transcripts that we print in the newspaper that's back there. And so in this sort of smaller reading group, there are conversations about our events and what we do, and what we hope to accomplish also in New York. There's some events planned for the fall.
In the most recent issue, you can hear my shining voice reverberating through your heads in an interview I did last year here at NYU. Just to put one quick finer point, well, two things. One, I haven't eaten any dinner, so if people want to go somewhere, I would be very happy for anyone and everyone to join. Often after these events, we go to the Kanji Village on Bowery. Stop shaking your head, because it's big and can fit lots of people, so I will guess, yeah, and it's cheap and it's drinks. It's not that far. We're in New York, you walk.
It's raining.
Number two, rain is great. The rain is the sadness of society that needs to be redeemed. But then the other sort of finer point I wanted to put, because I saw Chester shaking his head about, would Marxism disappear? I don't think resistance will disappear. There will always be David and Goliath. Like, I agree with liberals to that extent. But the question is, would there ever be anything else? And that the consciousness of the possibility of something else besides, lots of shit. The shit gets really bad. People resist some. It gets a little better, and then the shit moves elsewhere. Like, that kind of dynamic, which has thus far basically been human history. Like, I've just summarized human history there. The possibility of that being different, I think, really could die. I actually think that most of people in our generation, certainly don't expect anything but that to be the case. Like, they expect the way things are in the present to be likely mostly the way things are in the future, except with some, cooler gadgets. But the kind of, the large scope of the way in which our society has been organized, continues to be organized, I think the consciousness of possibility of changing that really could disappear, which is why I take very seriously Marxism and why I don't, go read Joyce all day, which would probably be much more pleasurable. But, okay. Thanks, guys.
The sign-up sheet's in the back. It's an event sign-up sheet, so you're not going to get bombarded with emails. It's just the things that we do in New York. And then there's
Constantine,
free
what do I press?
newspaper.
Sure.